Hi, I'm Michael Warshauer. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about railroad grade crossing collisions. These are incidences in which a railroad train hits a car or truck at a grade crossing. Our law firm has experience in both representing the crew, that is the engineers, conductors, brakemen, and flagmen who are working on the train, as well as what I guess some people would call the civilians or public traffic, that is the truck drivers and automobile drivers who are hit by the train. Talk about a couple of things that we are always going to look for and be curious about when we do these cases. The first thing we're going to look at, unfortunately, is the driver of the vehicle conduct. Did they stop? What was their visibility? And is it reasonable for them to have pulled out in front of a train? Certainly most people's common sense is that no, they pulled in front of the train didn't leave the tracks to hit them. Well, there are often reasons why people pull in front of a train that are excusable and in fact shift the blame from the driver, from the motorist to the train. Some of these involve gates, lights, and bells that are inoperative or inconsistent, or giving false positives or false negatives and therefore lead the driver to believe that it's safe to proceed. Some of these are visibility problems wherein the driver pulls up and believes that there's no train coming because they simply can't see. Railroads do have a duty of reasonable care to make sure that where they can control vegetation, they do control vegetation, to allow the motorist a fair chance at seeing the oncoming train. Some of these have to do with blockages created by the railroad itself. On numerous occasions, we've represented both freight train crews and motorists. When the motorist pulls up to a grade crossing and sees a train that is parked relatively close to the track, or to the road on a double track system. The lights might well be flashing, but the motorist assumes, and really fairly so, that the signals are being activated by the stationary train, perhaps just a few cars that have been left there by a freight train crew. And when they pull past that freight train, unfortunately another train is coming and they are hit, and obviously there's a tragedy as a result. Well, railroads have a duty to keep the grade crossing so that you can get reasonable visibility. And that means that they should not park cars so that they impede the motorist visibility or impede the visibility of the freight train crew. The other thing we're going to look at is the freight train crew conduct. Were they operating within the speed limits set by the Federal Railway, approved by the Federal Railway Administration? Was the track of sufficient quality to allow that speed to be set in the first place? Did they have adequate warning devices on the train? Was the headlight working? Were the ditch lights flashing? Was the horn sounded? So we'll be looking at that. Sadly, we have represented several motorists where the freight train crew was actually asleep. And it's easy to blame that on the crew. They shouldn't fall asleep. But sometimes the crew is so overworked by the railroad that it's virtually predictable that they'll fall asleep. Either way, the railroad is liable because the crew and the train were operating on its behalf at the time of the event. In modern railroading, almost every grade crossing that's anywhere away from the yard is going to be recorded by a video camera on the lead end of the locomotive. Our firm has led the way in making sure that the railroads have to provide us with copies of those videos so that we can study them and have them analyzed by our own experts and not just rely blindly on what we see. Because sometimes what we see is not a fair representation of what really occurred at the event. Another thing that we're going to be looking at is electronic data. We're going to be looking at the electronic data from the automobile or truck, and we're going to be looking at the electronic data in addition to the video from the freight train. They have what's commonly called a black box, but technically called an event recorder. and we have the ability through our experts to review and understand that, and it will tell us the speed of the train, often when the horn was applied, when the brakes were applied. But things that the public needs to keep in mind when you approach a grade crossing is that just because the train wasn't there before doesn't mean it's not going to be there on this approach. We call that the benign experience problem. That is, even a busy track that has several trains a day will have 20 plus hours a day with no train. So most of the time when you come to that track, there's no train there. That creates an expectation that there will be no train every time. This can lead to tragic consequences, and it's why it's so important that railroads, whenever possible, install gates, lights, and bells. And one of the things we look at with the installation of gates, lights, and bells is that sometimes the municipality or government organization that operates the road that crosses the track will have contracted and approved the gates, lights, and bells, but the railroad just doesn't get around to it for months or even years. And we believe that's careless, and they ought to be responsible for anything that happens in the interim. So that's just an overview of railroad grade crossing cases. We have a great deal of experience in these kinds of cases, and we can answer any questions you have. So if you have any questions, give us a call. We'll be glad to help. It's what we do. Thank you.